Across the galaxy, mothers tell their children bedtime stories about the monsters that lurk in the dark between stars. They speak in hushed whispers about the creatures who refuse to kneel, who turn planets into graveyards, and who make even the mightiest empires tremble. These aren't tales of mythical beasts or ancient demons, they're stories about humans. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Consortium has ruled with absolute authority over 10,000 worlds. Their fleets could crack moons, their armies could conquer systems, and their influence stretched across every corner of known space. Every species had learned to bow before their might. Every species except one. The humans were supposed to be extinct. The record showed their homeworld reduced to cosmic dust, their colonies scattered to the void, their resistance crushed beneath the weight of imperial justice. Yet somehow, impossibly, the ghost stories persisted. Ships would vanish in the outer systems. Pirate fleets would be found drifting empty in space, their crews simply gone. And, sometimes, in the deepest dark of space, sensors would catch something that couldn't be there, a human ship, moving like a predator among the stars. Today, in the heart of the Consortium's greatest palace, a tiny princess is about to discover that some monsters are real. And, sometimes, they come home. Princess Zarathil had always been too curious for her own good. At barely 8 cycles old, she possessed the kind of relentless inquisitiveness that made her royal tutors nervously adjust their ceremonial robes whenever she asked her endless questions. Her tiny form, no bigger than a human child despite her advanced age by galactic standards, had a habit of appearing in places where princesses definitely should not be. The Kethmori were a species known for their ethereal beauty and diplomatic grace. Standing tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like starlight and elongated limbs that moved with fluid precision, they had been the face of the Galactic Consortium for over a millennium. Their homeworld, HFY Prime, served as the beating heart of an empire that stretched across 10,000 systems, and their royal palace was considered the most magnificent structure in known space. The Palace of Eternal Harmony rose from the planetary surface like a crystalline mountain, its spires reaching so high they disappeared into the upper atmosphere. Each level was dedicated to a different aspect of galactic governance, from the lower courts where minor disputes were settled, to the highest chambers where the fate of entire civilizations was decided. The architecture itself seemed to sing, with harmonic resonators built into every wall that created a constant, soothing melody that was said to promote peace and contemplation. Princess Zarathil, however, was far more interested in the parts of the palace that didn't sing. Deep beneath the harmonious upper levels, past the gleaming halls where diplomats from 1,000 worlds conducted their business, lay the foundations of the palace. These lower chambers were practical rather than beautiful, filled with the machinery that kept the massive structure functioning. Most importantly for a curious princess, they were largely unguarded and full of interesting hiding spots. It was here that Zarathil had discovered the archive of sealed records. The chamber was vast and dimly lit, filled with towering shelves that stretched up into darkness. Each shelf contained thousands of data crystals, each crystal holding the collected knowledge of civilizations that had fallen under consortium rule. Most of these records were mundane trade agreements, population censuses, cultural studies. But some sections were marked with warning symbols that made Zarathil's naturally rebellious spirit practically vibrate with excitement. She had been exploring the archives for several weeks now, always during the mid-cycle rest period when the palace settled into its quietest hours. Her small size allowed her to squeeze between shelves and climb to sections that the adult archivists rarely visited. Most of the forbidden records dealt with species that had resisted consortium rule and had been subsequently eliminated or absorbed. Reading about these lost civilizations filled Zarathil with a mixture of sadness and fascination. Today, however, she had found something different. Hidden behind a row of particularly dusty crystals, tucked away as if someone had deliberately tried to hide it, was a crystal marked with symbols Zarathil had never seen before. The warning labels were in an ancient form of consortium script, but she could make out enough to understand that this record dealt with something called the Human Threat Assessment. Humans. Zarathil had heard whispered stories about humans, usually late at night when the adults thought she was sleeping. They were always spoken of in the same breath as cautionary tales and nightmare stories. According to palace gossip, humans were a primitive species that had been eliminated centuries ago for their refusal to integrate peacefully into consortium society. Some of the older servants would cross themselves with protective gestures when the name was mentioned, as if speaking it might summon something terrible. But this crystal was different from the horror stories. As Zarathil activated it and began to read, she discovered something extraordinary. Humans weren't just another conquered species. They were something the Consortium had never encountered before or since. The record began with standard classification data. Humans were a bipedal mammalian species from a world they called Earth, located in what was now known as the Dead Zone, a region of space that had been quarantined and sterilized 3,000 years ago. They had achieved faster-than-light travel relatively recently and had been expanding aggressively into nearby systems when they encountered Consortium exploratory forces. Initial contact had followed standard protocols. The Consortium had offered humanity the same choice given to every species: integrate into galactic society under Consortium guidance, accept assigned roles within the greater imperial structure, and enjoy the peace and prosperity that came with submission to superior wisdom. It was an offer that had been accepted by every sentient species for over a millennium. Humans had responded by declaring war on the entire galaxy. What followed was unlike any conflict in recorded history. Humans didn't fight like any civilized species. They didn't engage in formal battles with established rules of engagement. They didn't target military installations while leaving civilian populations untouched. They didn't surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. Instead, they became something that the galaxy had never seen before: apex predators operating on an interstellar scale. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts. They would strike at Consortium fleets using tactics that violated every principle of honorable warfare. They targeted supply lines, communication networks, and civilian infrastructure with ruthless efficiency. When Consortium forces tried to retaliate against human colonies, they would find empty worlds. Entire populations had simply vanished, taking their technology and resources with them. But it was the individual accounts that truly unsettled Zarathil. Admiral Vextar of the 47th Fleet reported encountering a single human ship that had somehow infiltrated a formation of 50 Consortium vessels. The human ship was smaller and less advanced than any of the surrounding craft, yet it had systematically disabled 17 ships before disappearing into the void. Security recordings showed the human vessel moving through their formation like a predator among prey, striking with surgical precision at critical systems before vanishing again. Captain Mordell of the Conquest Squadron filed a report about boarding a seemingly abandoned human vessel, only to discover that the humans had rigged their own ship to explode, taking the boarding party with them. But before the explosion, the surviving Consortium forces reported that the humans had looked them in the eyes and smiled. Commander Zethril described finding a human outpost that had been under siege for months. When Consortium forces finally breached the defenses, they expected to find a defeated population ready to surrender. Instead, they found humans who had been fighting so long they had run out of proper weapons and were using improvised explosives and handcrafted projectile weapons. Even more disturbing, the humans had been winning. The reports painted a picture of a species that simply refused to accept defeat. Where other races would surrender when faced with impossible odds, humans would adapt. Where others would negotiate when their position became untenable, humans would find new ways to fight. They treated warfare not as a regrettable necessity but as a science to be perfected. But what truly made humans unique wasn't their tactical brilliance or their technological innovation. It was their psychological profile. According to the analysis, humans possess something called pack bonding, an ability to form emotional connections not just with their own species, but with virtually any creature they encountered. This bonding was so strong that humans would risk their own lives to protect beings they had known for mere hours. The psychological evaluation team had initially dismissed this as a weakness, but battlefield reports told a different story. Humans didn't just fight for territory or resources, they fought for each other. A human who lost their pack-bonded companions would enter a psychological state the reports called berserker rage, becoming essentially a living weapon that would continue fighting until either their enemies were destroyed or they themselves were killed. Even more remarkably, this pack bonding extended beyond their own species. There were verified reports of humans adopting alien refugees and fighting with the same intensity to protect them as they would their own families. The Consortium had faced rebels before, but never an entire species that turned every member into a potential resistance fighter. Human children as young as 10 cycles were found carrying weapons and engaging in sabotage operations.
Human elderly would detonate suicide bombs rather than provide intelligence to consortium interrogators.
Human civilians would sacrifice themselves to buy time for others to escape, and they would do it with what observers described as terrifying cheerfulness. But, perhaps most unsettling of all were the reports of human empathy. Unlike most species, humans seemed capable of understanding and predicting the behavior of completely alien minds. They would study their enemies not just to defeat them, but to understand them. There were multiple accounts of human prisoners who had somehow convinced their consortium guards to help them escape, not through threats or bribery, but by forming genuine emotional connections that transcended species boundaries. The psychological assessment concluded that humans were essentially a species-wide anomaly. They combined the tactical thinking of apex predators with the emotional depth of the most advanced civilizations, creating individuals who could be simultaneously the most dangerous and most compassionate beings in the galaxy. As Princess Zarathil read deeper into the records, she began to understand why the archive had been sealed. The war against humanity hadn't ended with conquest, it had ended with extermination. The consortium had been forced to deploy planet-killing weapons against every human world, turning their entire region of space into a radioactive wasteland. It was the only way to stop them. The official records stated that all humans had been eliminated, their species extinct, their threat permanently neutralized. But, buried deep in the classified sections were troubling addendums. Ships had gone missing in the dead zone. Exploration teams had vanished without trace. And, sometimes, in the deepest space, sensors would detect movement where nothing should exist. The final entry in the record was dated only 50 years ago, barely a lifetime by galactic standards. It was a brief report from a deep space patrol that claimed to have encountered what they described as a ghost ship in the outer rim. The vessel had appeared on their sensors for only moments before vanishing, but long-range scans had detected architecture and energy signatures consistent with human technology. The report had been filed under sensor malfunction and the crew had been reassigned to inner system duties. Princess Zarathil sat back in her hiding spot, her mind reeling. Everything she had been taught about humans was wrong. They weren't mindless monsters or primitive savages. They were something far more complex and far more dangerous. They were people who simply refused to give up. As she prepared to hide the crystal and return to her chambers, a sound echoed through the archives that made her small heart nearly stop beating. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that didn't match the soft, gliding movement of her people. These steps had weight behind them, the kind of measured pace that spoke of someone who was comfortable moving through hostile territory. Zarathil quickly extinguished her reading light and pressed herself deeper into her hiding spot between the shelves. Through a gap in the crystals, she could see a figure moving through the archives with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged there. But this person definitely didn't belong in the royal palace. The figure was tall but not elegant, built for function rather than beauty. Their clothing was dark and practical, designed for movement rather than ceremony. Most shocking of all, they were alone, no guards, no escorts, no ceremonial entourage. In a palace where even minor functionaries traveled with proper protocol, this person moved like they owned the place. As the figure passed closer to her hiding spot, Zarathil caught a glimpse of their face in the dim light of the archives. The features were unlike any species she had ever seen: strong bone structure, forward-facing eyes, and an expression of calm determination that sent chills down her spine. The stories her nursemates had told her came flooding back, and, suddenly, Princess Zarathil understood exactly what she was looking at. Standing in the heart of the Galactic Consortium's most secure facility, moving through the palace like they had every right to be there, was a human. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Humans weren't extinct. At least one had somehow survived the extermination, somehow evaded the quarantine, somehow made their way to the very heart of the empire that had destroyed their species. And, now they were here, in her home, doing something that required access to the most sensitive archives in the galaxy. Zarathil watched in fascination and terror as the human moved directly to a section she had never explored, pulling crystals with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. They worked in complete silence, their movements economical and purposeful. Every few minutes they would pause and listen, their head turning with the alertness of a predator checking for threats. After what felt like an eternity, the human finished their work and began to leave. As they passed Zarathil's hiding spot again, they suddenly stopped.
For one heart-stopping moment, the princess was certain she had been discovered. The human's head turned slightly in her direction, and she could see their profile clearly. The face was younger than she had expected, probably barely into adulthood by human standards. But the eyes held an ancient weariness that spoke of experiences no young person should have endured. Those eyes swept over her hiding spot without seeming to see her, but Zarathil had the unsettling feeling that she had been noticed and simply deemed non-threatening. Then, the human smiled, not the predatory grin described in the reports, but something sadder and more complex, and continued on their way. Princess Zarathil remained hidden until long after the footsteps had faded, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. A human was alive. A human was here. And, somehow, incredibly, they had infiltrated the most secure location in the galaxy. As she finally crept back to her chambers, one thought echoed through her mind above all others: if this human was here, in the heart of consortium power, what exactly were they planning to do? The next morning brought news that would shake the foundations of everything Zarathil thought she knew about her world. But, for now, she had a secret that burned inside her chest like a star about to explode. A human was alive, and they were coming for the consortium. The morning after her encounter in the archives, Princess Zarathil discovered that keeping monumental secrets was significantly more difficult than uncovering them. During her morning meal with her parents, Emperor Kethvar and Empress Salandra, she found herself studying their elegant features and wondering what they would do if they knew a human was walking through their palace. Her father, Emperor Kethvar, was considered one of the most brilliant leaders in galactic history. His tall, imposing frame radiated the kind of natural authority that made entire star systems fall into line with a single gesture. His skin held the deep silver luminescence that marked him as true royal bloodline, and his movements carried the fluid grace that had made the Kethmori the natural diplomatic leaders of the consortium. Empress Salandra possessed a different kind of power. Where her husband commanded through presence, she influenced through understanding. Her ability to read the emotional undercurrents of any situation had prevented countless conflicts and negotiated treaties that had lasted for centuries. She was known throughout the galaxy as the Peace Weaver, and her wisdom was sought by leaders from every corner of known space. Both of them were completely unaware that their breakfast conversation about trade disputes and diplomatic schedules was taking place within walking distance of a creature their government had supposedly exterminated. "You seem unusually quiet this morning, little star," Empress Salandra observed, using the pet name she had given Zarathil as an infant. "Are your studies troubling you?" Zarathil nearly choked on her morning nutrient supplement. "Studies indeed. No, mother. I was just thinking about the archives. There are so many interesting historical records there." Emperor Kethvar looked up from his reports with mild surprise. "The archives? I wasn't aware you had developed an interest in historical documentation. Perhaps we should arrange for a proper scholarly guide to assist your studies." The thought of a guide discovering her secret exploration sent panic shooting through Zarathil's system. "Oh no, father. I prefer to explore on my own. It helps me think better." Her parents exchanged the kind of look that married couples develop after centuries together, a quick glance that conveyed volumes of understanding. Zarathil had seen that look before, usually right before they made decisions she wasn't going to like. Independent study can be valuable, her mother agreed carefully, but perhaps with some boundaries. The archives contain some materials that might not be appropriate for someone your age. If only they knew exactly how inappropriate, Zarathil thought. "Of course, mother. I'll be careful." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Zarathil found herself unable to concentrate. Every time someone entered the dining hall, she looked up expecting to see a human face among the elegant Kethmori features. Every unexpected sound made her wonder if the human was moving through the palace at that very moment, working toward whatever goal had brought them here. After breakfast, Zarathil made her way to her scheduled language lessons with Tutor Vexlin, an ancient Kethmori scholar who had been teaching royal children for longer than most species' entire lifespans. The old tutor had a habit of droning on about grammatical structures and linguistic evolution in a voice that could put a hyperdrive core to sleep, which normally gave Zarathil plenty of opportunity to daydream. Today, however, she found herself paying attention when the lesson turned to extinct languages. "The tragedy of conquest," Tutor Vexlin was saying in his creaky voice, "is not merely the loss of territory or resources,
but the permanent silencing of unique forms of expression. When a species is eliminated, their language dies with them, and, with it, concepts and ideas that no other species will ever develop.
Have many languages been lost? Zarathil asked, trying to keep her voice casual.
Oh yes, young princess.
Dozens over the millennia.
The Vortai mathematical language, the Zephyrian emotion songs, the crystalline harmonic communications. The old tutor paused, his expression growing more serious. And, of course, the human linguistic family, though that loss was necessary for galactic stability. There was something in the way he said it that made Zarathil look up sharply.
What made their language special? Tutor Vexlim's ancient eyes seemed to focus on something far away. Human languages were remarkably adaptive.
They could incorporate concepts from other species with unprecedented speed and accuracy. More than that, they seemed capable of expressing concepts that bridged the emotional and logical in ways we still don't fully understand. Their literature contained ideas that... He stopped himself, shaking his head.
But, this is ancient history, young princess.
Perhaps we should return to your galactic standard conjugations.
But, Zarathil had caught the note of something almost like regret in his voice. Tutor Vexlim, do you think the humans deserved what happened to them?
The old scholar's hands went very still, his stylus hovering over his datapad. For a long moment, the only sound in the study chamber was the distant harmonics of the palace walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It is not for us to judge the decisions of our betters, young princess. The humans represented a threat to galactic order that required decisive action.
But...
He paused again, glancing around as if checking for listeners.
I was a young scholar during the human conflict.
I had the opportunity to study some of their captured communications before they were classified. Their final messages were not what one would expect from a savage species facing extinction.
What were they like?
They were love letters, he said simply.
Parents saying goodbye to children they would never see again.
Partners promising to find each other somehow, somewhere beyond death. Soldiers recording messages of hope for futures they knew they would never witness. Even facing annihilation, they spoke not of revenge or hatred, but of love and the belief that somehow, something good would survive them. The weight of those words settled over the study chamber like a heavy blanket.
Zarathil found herself thinking about the human in the archives, wondering what had driven them to risk everything to come here. After her lessons, Zarathil made her way through the palace corridors with new eyes. Every elegant curve of the architecture, every harmonious tone from the walls, every display of consortium power now seemed like a monument built on a foundation of deliberate extinction. The beauty felt hollow, like a song with all the emotion carefully removed. She was so lost in thought that she nearly missed the commotion near the central communication hub. A group of palace security officers were clustered around the main information terminal, their usually calm demeanors showing signs of strain. Captain Morthek, the head of palace security, was speaking in the rapid, clipped tones that indicated high stress among the Kethmori. I want every access log checked twice, he was saying. Someone with advanced technical knowledge gained unauthorized entry to the secured databases last night. This represents a massive security breach. Zarathil's blood went cold. The human had been discovered. What exactly was accessed? Asked Lieutenant Zarvel, her voice tight with concern.
Multiple classified historical databases, Captain Morthek replied. Personnel files, strategic assessments, and, most concerning, the sealed records from the Dead Zone conflicts. One of the younger officers, barely out of training academy, raised his hand tentatively.
Sir, is it possible this was an internal breach? Perhaps someone with proper clearance was conducting authorized research? Captain Morthek's expression darkened. The access patterns don't match any authorized personnel.
Whoever did this knew exactly where to look and exactly what they wanted. They moved through our security systems like they had detailed knowledge of our protocols.
Could it be an enemy agent? Lieutenant Zarvel asked.
That's what worries me, the captain replied.
The level of sophistication required suggests state-level intelligence capabilities.
But, we're not currently in conflict with any species that possesses this kind of technical expertise.
Zarathil pressed herself closer to the wall, straining to hear every word while trying to remain invisible. The officers continued their discussion, throwing around theories about possible sources of infiltration, but none of them came close to the truth. How could they? The idea that a supposedly extinct human, had waltzed into their most secure facility was beyond their ability to conceive. As the security meeting began to break up, Zarathil hurried away before she could be noticed. But, as she walked, she found herself thinking about something Captain Morthek had said. The human had moved through their systems like they had detailed knowledge of consortium protocols. How was that possible? If humans had been extinct for 3,000 years, how could one of them know enough about current consortium security to breach the palace systems? Unless... The thought that formed in Zarathil's mind was so disturbing that she had to stop walking and lean against a wall for support. What if humans hadn't been extinct at all? What if some had survived, hidden somewhere in the galaxy, watching and learning and planning for 3,000 years? The implications were staggering. It would mean that everything she had been taught about galactic history was a lie. It would mean that somewhere out there, an entire civilization existed that had every reason to hate the consortium with the burning intensity of 3 millennia worth of grief and rage. And one of them was here, in her home, with access to information that could potentially bring down the government. That evening, Zarathil made a decision that would have horrified her parents if they had known about it. Instead of remaining safely in her chambers as she was supposed to during night cycle, she crept back down to the archive levels. She needed to understand what the human had been looking for, and, more importantly, she needed to know if they were coming back. The archives felt different in the deeper darkness of night cycle. The usually comforting harmonics of the palace seemed muted here, replaced by the subtle hums and whirs of data storage systems. Emergency lighting cast long shadows between the towering shelves, creating the kind of environment where imagination could easily run wild. Zarathil made her way to the section where she had seen the human working. A quick examination revealed that several crystals had been disturbed, pulled out slightly from their proper positions as if someone had been examining them quickly and had not had time to replace them perfectly. She selected one at random and activated it. What she found made her small hands shake. The crystal contained personnel files, detailed biographical information about high-ranking consortium officials, complete with security clearances, family connections, and daily schedules. But these weren't historical records. These were current files, updated within the last few cycles. The human hadn't just been researching the past. They had been gathering intelligence on the present. As Zarathil scrolled through the data, a pattern began to emerge. The files the human had accessed weren't random. They all had one thing in common: every individual in these records had been alive during the human extermination. They were the surviving officers, diplomats, and administrators who had participated in the decision to destroy an entire species. The human was building a target list. The realization hit Zarathil like a physical blow. This wasn't just about gathering information. This was preparation for something much more serious. The human was here for revenge. As she processed this terrifying possibility, a soft sound made her freeze. Footsteps. The same measured, purposeful footsteps she had heard the night before. The human was coming back. This time, Zarathil didn't hide. She couldn't explain the impulse that made her step out into the aisle where she could be seen, but something deep inside her rebelled against cowering in the shadows again. If she was going to encounter one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, she was going to do it with whatever dignity her 8-year-old self could muster. The footsteps stopped. For a moment that stretched into eternity, there was absolute silence in the archives. Then, the human appeared at the end of the aisle, and Zarathil got her first clear look at one of the most feared creatures in galactic history. They were younger than she had expected, probably no more than 25 cycles, which was barely adult by most species standards. They were wearing the same dark, practical clothing as the night before, but up close Zarathil could see details that the shadows had hidden. The fabric was clearly high quality, designed for someone who needed to move silently and blend into crowds. More interesting were the small devices attached to their belt, technology that Zarathil didn't recognize but which radiated the kind of subtle menace that suggested weapons. But it was their face that captured her attention. The features were strong and symmetrical in a way that was pleasing without being elegant like her own species. Their skin was a warm brown color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it.
Most striking of all were their eyes, dark brown and filled with an intelligence that was somehow both ancient and youthful. Those eyes were currently fixed on her with an expression of mild surprise.
"Well," the human said in perfectly accented galactic standard, their voice carrying a warmth that was completely at odds with everything Zarathil had been taught about their species, "this is unexpected."
Princess Zarathil drew herself up to her full height, which admittedly wasn't very impressive, and tried to project the kind of royal authority that her mother wielded so effortlessly.
"You're not supposed to be here."
The human's mouth quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile.
"Neither are you, princess." The casual use of her title sent shockwaves through Zarathil's system. This human knew who she was.
They had been in the palace long enough to identify the royal family members.
The implications were terrifying.
"You know who I am," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Princess Zarathil, youngest daughter of Emperor Kefvar and Empress Silandra, noted for her curiosity and independent spirit." The human's tone was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than revealing intelligence that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance.
"You have a habit of exploring places you're not supposed to be."
"And you're supposed to be extinct," Zarathil replied with more bravery than she felt. This time the human did smile, but it was an expression filled with infinite sadness.
"Reports of our extinction have been greatly exaggerated. What do you want?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper.
The human studied her for a long moment, their expression becoming more serious.
"That's a complicated question with a complicated answer. But, since you asked."
They gestured to the crystal still glowing in Zarathil's hands. "I suppose you've already started figuring it out."
Zarathil looked down at the personnel files she had been reviewing.
"You're here for revenge.
You want to kill the people who destroyed your species. Is that what you think?" the human asked, their tone genuinely curious. "The files you accessed, they're all people who were involved in the extermination. You're building a list of targets." The human nodded slowly. "You're not wrong.
But you're not entirely right either." They moved closer, and Zarathil was surprised to realize that she didn't feel threatened.
There was something about this human's presence that was calming rather than menacing. "May I ask you something, princess?" Zarathil nodded, not trusting her voice. "What do you know about the actual events of 3,000 years ago?"
"Not the official history, but the real story of what happened between humans and the consortium." "I know you refused to integrate peacefully," Zarathil said, reciting what she had been taught. "I know you started a war that threatened galactic stability. I know the consortium had no choice but to eliminate your species to preserve peace."
The human's expression grew even sadder. "And what do the archives say?" "The real archives, not the sanitized versions they teach to children."
Zarathil thought about the records she had read the night before, the accounts of human tactics, their refusal to surrender, their terrifying ability to adapt and persist.
"They say you wouldn't give up.
Even when you were obviously going to lose, you kept fighting."
"We did," the human agreed. "And, do you know why? Because you were too primitive to understand when you were beaten?" The humans shook their head. "Because they didn't just want us to surrender, princess. They wanted us to disappear. Not just our military, not just our government, our entire species. Every man, woman, and child.
Every memory, every story, every song. They wanted to erase us from existence so completely that future generations would never know we had lived." The words hit Zarathil like a series of physical blows.
"That's not, the consortium doesn't do that. We integrate species, we don't eliminate them."
"Usually, yes," the human agreed.
"Most species fit neatly into the roles the consortium assigns.
But we were different.
We couldn't be categorized, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be made to fit into their system of galactic order.
So they decided the galaxy would be better off without us."
Zarathil felt the foundations of her worldview beginning to crack.
But there were negotiations. There were opportunities for peace. There were ultimatums, the human corrected gently.
"Submit completely or be destroyed."
No middle ground, no compromise, no recognition of our right to exist as we were. They paused, their eyes becoming distant.
Do you know what the final offer was, Princess? They would allow 10% of our population to survive as a curiosity.
A living museum exhibit to show future generations what humans had been like before they were properly civilized.
The archive chamber seemed to spin around Zarathil as the implications of those words sank in. You're lying.
I wish I was, the human said sadly. But, those records are in these same archives, if you know where to look. The consortium kept meticulous documentation of their decisions.
So what do you want? Zarathil asked again, her voice barely above a whisper.
If you're here for revenge. I'm not here for revenge, Princess, the human said, and their voice carried a conviction that made Zarathil believe them.
I'm here for justice.
And, sometimes, those are very different things. Before Zarathil could ask what that meant, the sound of distant voices echoed through the archives. Security guards, probably conducting a sweep after the previous night's breach. The human's demeanor changed instantly, becoming alert and focused. You need to leave, Princess.
Now. What about you?
The human smiled again, and, this time it carried a hint of something predatory.
I'm very good at not being found when I don't want to be.
As the voices grew closer, Zarathil found herself backing toward her usual exit route. But, before she left, she had to ask one more question.
Will I see you again? The human considered this for a moment.
That depends, Princess.
How much do you really want to know the truth about your galaxy?
Then, they melted back into the shadows between the shelves, disappearing so completely that Zarathil almost wondered if the entire encounter had been a dream.
Almost.
But, the crystal in her hands was still warm, still displaying the personnel files that painted a very different picture of her world than the one she had grown up believing. As she made her way back to her chambers, Princess Zarathil realized that her life had just been divided into two parts, before she met the human, and after. And, she had the terrible, wonderful feeling that she would never be the same.
The next few days passed in a haze of barely contained anxiety for Princess Zarathil.
Every meal with her parents became an exercise in deception as she smiled and nodded through conversations about trade agreements and diplomatic ceremonies, all while her mind churned with questions about everything she thought she knew about her world. Every lesson with her tutors felt surreal as they discussed the principles of galactic harmony and consortium justice, concepts that now seemed to rest on foundations far more fragile than she had ever imagined. But, it was during her evening meal 3 days after her encounter with the human that everything began to unravel. The royal family was dining in the smaller, more intimate family chamber, a space reserved for private conversations away from the formality of state functions. The room was beautiful in the understated way that characterized all Kathmori design, with walls that sang soft harmonies and furniture that seemed to flow organically from the floor itself. Normally, Zarathil found the space comforting, but tonight the familiar surroundings felt like a stage set, beautiful but somehow artificial. Emperor Kethvar was discussing recent intelligence reports with Empress Salandra, their conversation casual but clearly important. Zarathil was only half listening until she heard a word that made her nearly choke on her food. The security breach in the archives has everyone concerned, her father was saying, his normally melodious voice carrying undertones of real worry. Someone with sophisticated technical capabilities gained access to some of our most sensitive historical records.
Empress Salandra set down her eating utensil with the careful precision that meant she was thinking deeply.
What type of records? Various classified databases, but the pattern suggests they were specifically interested in personnel files from the old human conflict. Emperor Kethvar paused, his silver-luminous skin dimming slightly, a sign of stress among their species. Captain Morthek believes it might be the work of a foreign intelligence service, but I'm not so certain. What makes you doubt that theory? The Empress asked. The level of access they achieved suggests intimate knowledge of our security protocols, not just general hacking capabilities. More concerning is their choice of targets. They specifically sought out information about individuals who were involved in the decision-making process 3,000 years ago. Zarathil's heart was beating so fast she was amazed her parents couldn't hear it. Her father was describing exactly what she had witnessed, but his interpretation was leading him toward conclusions that were simultaneously right and completely wrong. Most of those individuals are still alive, Empress Salandra observed. Are you suggesting this might be related to some kind of revenge plot? It's possible, the Emperor replied grimly. But, revenge by whom? The humans were completely eliminated. We have 3 millennia of sensor data from the dead zone confirming that nothing could have survived in that region of space. Perhaps descendant species, the Empress suggested. Some civilization that views humans as ancestors or cultural heroes? Zarathil wanted to scream. Her parents were dancing around the truth with logical precision, never quite allowing themselves to consider the impossible possibility that was staring them in the face. The humans weren't extinct. At least one had survived, and they were here, in this very building, listening to conversations like this one and planning. What? I've ordered increased security throughout the palace, Emperor Kethvar continued. But, I'm also considering whether we should begin discreet inquiries among our allies about any new intelligence activities they might have detected. That might be wise, Empress Salandra agreed. Though I wonder if we should also consider the possibility that this breach represents something more significant than simple espionage. Her father's expression grew more serious. What do you mean? The human conflict was the only time in consortium history that we resorted to complete species elimination, the Empress said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had studied history far more deeply than most. It represented a failure of our normal integration processes. If someone is investigating those events now, they might be questioning the legitimacy of our actions. Emperor Kethvar was quiet for a long moment, his luminescence continuing to dim as stress deepened. The decisions made during the human conflict were necessary for galactic stability. The humans represented a fundamental threat to the order we had spent millennia building. I know that, his wife said gently. But, history has a way of being reinterpreted by each generation. What seemed necessary 3,000 years ago might appear differently to contemporary eyes. Are you suggesting our actions were wrong? The question hung in the air like a discordant note in the chamber's harmonies. Zarathil held her breath, realizing she was about to witness a conversation that would reshape her understanding of her own parents. I'm suggesting, Empress Salandra said carefully, that the complete elimination of an entire species is an action that should never be taken lightly, and that those of us who inherit the consequences of such decisions bear the responsibility of understanding exactly what was done and why. The humans refused every offer of peaceful integration, Emperor Kethvar said, but his voice carried a note of defensiveness that Zarathil had never heard before. They chose war over diplomacy. Did they? The Empress asked quietly. Or did we offer them the illusion of choice while making it clear that anything less than complete submission would result in their destruction? The silence that followed was so profound that the chamber's harmonics seemed to falter. Zarathil stared at her parents in shock. Her mother, the Peace Weaver herself, was questioning the fundamental narrative upon which consortium authority was built. Salandra, the Emperor said carefully, these are dangerous thoughts. All important thoughts are dangerous, my love, the Empress replied. But, they become more dangerous when they're left unexamined. What are you proposing? Empress Salandra was quiet for a moment, her elegant features reflecting the kind of deep contemplation that had made her legendary throughout the galaxy. I'm proposing that perhaps this security breach represents an opportunity as much as a threat. Someone is asking questions about our past. Instead of simply trying to stop them, perhaps we should be asking ourselves whether their questions deserve answers. Emperor Kethvar's expression grew alarmed. You're talking about reopening investigations into classified historical events. The implications would be enormous. The implications of refusing to examine our own actions might be even more enormous, his wife countered. How can we claim moral authority over the galaxy if we're unwilling to confront the darker aspects of our own history? Zarathil felt as if the floor beneath her chair was dissolving. Her parents weren't just discussing policy, they were revealing fundamental disagreements about the nature of their civilization. More than that, her mother seemed to be moving toward conclusions that aligned disturbingly well with what the human had told her. The decision to eliminate the humans wasn't made lightly, Emperor Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of someone defending a position he wasn't entirely comfortable with. The psychological profiles indicated they were fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization. They couldn't be integrated safely. Couldn't be,
the Empress asked, or wouldn't be allowed to exist in a way that didn't fit our preconceptions of what civilized species should look like? The question struck like a physical blow. Even Emperor Kethvar seemed shaken by its implications. You're suggesting we committed genocide not out of necessity but out of convenience?
I'm suggesting we may have committed genocide because we encountered a species that challenged our assumptions about how the galaxy should be ordered, and, rather than adapting our systems to accommodate them, we chose to eliminate the challenge itself.
The words hung in the air like an accusation.
Zarathil felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that her mother had just articulated exactly what the human had been trying to tell her. The consortium hadn't destroyed humanity because they were savage or dangerous, they had destroyed them because they were different. If what you're suggesting is true, Emperor Kethvar said slowly, then, our entire civilization is built on a foundation of murder.
Perhaps, Empress Salandra replied quietly.
Or perhaps it's built on a foundation that includes both great achievements and great crimes, and our responsibility is to acknowledge both while working to ensure the crimes are never repeated. Before either parent could say more, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morthek, who entered the chamber with the kind of urgent efficiency that indicated immediate crisis.
Your Majesties, he said, his voice tight with stress, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention.
Emperor Kethvar straightened in his chair, instantly transitioning from troubled husband to decisive ruler.
What has happened?
We've discovered additional security breaches, Captain Morthek reported.
Someone has been accessing palace systems far more extensively than we initially realized.
They've gained entry to communication logs, personnel schedules, and, most concerning, real-time surveillance feeds.
The implications hit Zarathil like a landslide.
The human hadn't just been gathering historical information, they had been monitoring current palace operations.
They might have been watching this very conversation. How is this possible? Empress Salandra demanded.
Our security systems are supposedly impregnable.
That's what we believed, Captain Morthek admitted. But, whoever is responsible for these breaches has demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything we've encountered before.
They're not just hacking our systems, they're moving through them like they understand our protocols better than we do ourselves.
Any theories about the source? Emperor Kethvar asked.
Captain Morthek hesitated for a moment, then spoke words that made Zarathil's blood turn to ice. Based on the patterns we're seeing, our technical analysis suggests the intrusions are being conducted by someone with intimate knowledge of consortium security architecture.
Either this is an inside job involving someone with the highest possible clearances, or what, the Empress prompted.
Or we're dealing with someone who has had decades, possibly centuries, to study our systems from the outside.
Someone who has been watching us for a very long time.
The chamber fell silent except for the faltering harmonics of the walls.
Zarathil watched her parents exchange a look that she recognized as the moment when two intelligent people simultaneously arrived at the same impossible conclusion.
You're suggesting, Emperor Kethvar said slowly, that someone who should be dead might not actually be dead. I'm suggesting, Your Majesty, that we may need to consider possibilities that contradict our fundamental assumptions about recent galactic history. The careful diplomatic language couldn't hide the revolutionary nature of what was being discussed.
For the first time in 3,000 years, high-ranking consortium officials were entertaining the possibility that their greatest enemies might still exist. What are your recommendations? Empress Salandra asked.
Immediate lockdown of all sensitive facilities, Captain Morthek replied.
Complete review of all personnel with high-level clearances. And...
He paused, clearly reluctant to voice his next suggestion.
I believe we should consider the possibility that the intruder is still in the palace.
Still here?
Emperor Kethvar's voice carried a note of disbelief. That would be impossible. We've conducted multiple sweeps.
With respect, Your Majesty, if we're dealing with someone who possesses the capabilities our analysis suggests, they might be able to evade conventional detection methods.
Zarathil felt her world contracting around her.
The adults were closing in on the truth through logic and deduction, which meant it was only a matter of time before they discovered the human's presence. More terrifying, they might discover her own involvement in these events.
I want the palace sealed immediately, Emperor Kethvar ordered.
No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization. double the guard rotations and implement continuous surveillance of all common areas.
Yes, Your Majesty, Captain Morthek replied. Should we also consider moving the royal family to a more secure location until the situation is resolved?
That won't be necessary, the Emperor said firmly.
If someone has invaded our home, we won't be driven from it.
But, I want to know everything about these intrusions, every file accessed, every system compromised, every possible clue about who is responsible. As Captain Morthek departed to implement the new security measures, Zarathil found herself in an impossible position. She possessed information that could help her parents understand what they were facing, but revealing that information would expose her own forbidden activities and, potentially put the human in even greater danger. The ethical complexity of the situation was overwhelming. On one hand, the human was clearly engaged in activities that could threaten her family and her government. On the other hand, if what they had told her was true, they might be seeking justice for crimes that her civilization had tried to bury. Zarathil, her mother's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, you've been very quiet during all of this.
Are you feeling well?
The question was delivered in the casual tone that parents use when they're actually probing for information.
Zarathil realized that her unusual behavior hadn't gone unnoticed.
I'm fine, Mother, she said, struggling to keep her voice level.
It's just scary to think that someone dangerous might be in our home.
Yes, Empress Salandra agreed, but her tone suggested she was thinking about more than just immediate physical danger.
It is frightening when we discover that things we believe to be impossible might actually be true.
The comment felt like it carried multiple layers of meaning, but, before Zarathil could analyze it further, her parents began discussing immediate security arrangements for the royal family.
As they talked, she found herself thinking about the human's final words to her, how much do you really want to know the truth about your galaxy?
At the time, she hadn't understood the full implications of the question. Now, sitting in a chamber where her own parents were beginning to question the foundations of their civilization, she was starting to realize that truth was a much more complex and dangerous thing than she had ever imagined. The conversation around her continued, filled with discussions of security protocols and safety measures, but Zarathil's mind was elsewhere. Somewhere in the vast complexity of the palace, a human was moving through the shadows, carrying knowledge that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of its own history. And, somehow, impossibly, she had become a part of whatever they were planning. As the evening wore on and the security lockdown tightened around the palace like a closing fist, Princess Zarathil made a decision that would have horrified her parents if they had known about it. Instead of accepting the protection being offered, instead of remaining safely ignorant of the forces moving around her, she chose to seek out the truth, regardless of the consequences.
That night, she would return to the archives one final time.
Not to hide and observe, but to find answers to questions that were becoming too important to ignore. The galaxy was built on secrets, and she was beginning to understand that some secrets were too dangerous to keep.
Getting to the archives proved far more challenging than Princess Zarathil had anticipated.
The security lockdown had transformed the palace from a home into something resembling a fortress under siege. Guards patrolled corridors that had been empty for centuries, their presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Advanced sensor arrays had been activated in areas where they had never been needed before, creating invisible webs of detection that made movement difficult for anyone who wasn't supposed to be wandering the halls. But Zarathil had spent her entire life exploring the hidden spaces of the palace, and she knew pathways that existed in the gaps between official architecture. Service corridors designed for maintenance drones, ventilation shafts that connected different levels, and forgotten passages that dated back to the palace's original construction. These spaces formed a secret geography that even the security forces didn't fully understand. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the archive levels, moving in careful stages and waiting for patrol patterns to create brief windows of opportunity. By the time she finally slipped into the familiar darkness of the record chambers, she was exhausted from the constant stress of avoiding detection.
The archives felt different under lockdown.
Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of any actual motion, and the background hum of security sensors created an undertone of mechanical paranoia that made the space feel hostile rather than welcoming. Even the air seemed thicker, as if the weight of secrets stored here was becoming physically manifest. Zarathil made her way to the section where she had first encountered the human, but, instead of hiding, she positioned herself in the central aisle where she would be clearly visible to anyone entering the area. If the human was still in the palace, as Captain Morthek believed, they would need to know that someone was looking for them deliberately.
The wait was agonizing.
Every sound in the vast chamber seemed amplified, from the subtle hum of data storage systems to the distant echoes of security patrols moving through other parts of the palace. Several times she thought she heard footsteps approaching, only to realize it was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. When the human finally appeared, they materialized so silently that Zarathil didn't notice them until they spoke. "This is either very brave or very foolish, Princess," came the familiar voice from the shadows near the sealed records section. Zarathil spun around, her heart leaping with a mixture of relief and terror. The human stepped into the emergency lighting, and she was struck again by how different they looked from the monsters of legend. If anything, they appeared more tired than threatening, as if the weight of whatever mission had brought them here was taking a visible toll. "I had to find you," Zarathil said, proud that her voice remained steady.
"I need answers."
"Answers to what?" the human asked, moving closer with that same fluid caution she had noticed before.
"To everything," Zarathil replied. "My parents are starting to question the official story about your species. The security forces are closing in on discovering your presence. And I need to know what you're really doing here before everything falls apart." The human studied her for a long moment, their dark eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. "You could simply report my presence to your security forces.
It would earn you significant praise from your parents and eliminate whatever threat you think I represent."
"Is that what you want me to do?"
"What I want," the human said with a sad smile, "is for this conversation to be unnecessary."
"But, since it isn't..."
They gestured toward a nearby reading alcove.
"Perhaps we should sit down.
The answers you're looking for are going to take some time to explain."
As they settled into the alcove, Zarathil found herself studying the human's face more carefully than she had been able to before.
The features were strong and symmetrical, but what struck her most was the expression in their eyes. There was wisdom there that seemed far too old for someone who appeared to be barely an adult, combined with a sadness so profound it made her chest ache. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. The human paused, as if the question had caught them off guard.
"My name is Marcus," they said finally. "Marcus Chen.
Though I suppose by your galactic standards, I should be called Ghost, since I'm supposed to be dead."
"How long have you been alive, Marcus?"
"That's a complicated question," Marcus replied. "I'm 24 standard years old by the biological measure. But I've been awake and aware for much longer than that."
"I don't understand."
Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal.
"Princess, what do you know about human life extension technology?" "Nothing," Zarathil admitted.
"The records said your species was technologically primitive." "The records were incomplete," Marcus said with a bitter laugh. "Humans developed several technologies that the consortium never fully understood, including methods for preserving consciousness across extended periods. When your people began their campaign of extermination, my ancestors didn't just hide, they went into deep hibernation, waiting for a time when they might be able to emerge safely."
The implications began to dawn on Zarathil. "How many?"
"Not many," Marcus said sadly. "Perhaps a few thousand, scattered across hidden facilities throughout what you call the dead zone."
"Most of my people really are gone, Princess."
"The consortium succeeded in destroying over 99% of our species. But a few survived, and, over the centuries, those few have been working toward a single goal."
"Revenge," Zarathil said.
"Justice," Marcus corrected gently. "There's a difference, though I understand why they might appear similar."
"What kind of justice?"
Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious.
"The truth, Princess. That's all we've ever wanted."
For 3,000 years, the galaxy has believed a lie about what happened to humanity. Your history books paint us as savages who refused to join galactic civilization.
The reality is that we were never given a genuine choice.
"But the negotiations were a performance," Marcus interrupted. "The consortium had already decided our fate before the first diplomatic contact was made. The psychological profiles, the cultural assessments, the integration studies, they were all designed to reach a predetermined conclusion."
Zarathil felt something cold forming in her stomach. "What conclusion?"
That humans were fundamentally incompatible with galactic order and needed to be eliminated for the greater good. Marcus's voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. We were different, Princess. We formed emotional bonds with other species too easily. We questioned authority too readily. We refused to accept that peaceful coexistence required cultural uniformity. In short, we represented everything the consortium couldn't control. So they decided to kill you all. They decided to erase us, Marcus corrected. Not just kill us, but remove every trace that we had ever existed. If not for the archived records in places like this, future generations would never have known that humanity had ever lived. The weight of those words settled over the alcove like a heavy blanket. Zarathil found herself thinking about all the species she had studied in her galactic history lessons, wondering how many others had been edited out of the official narratives. What are you planning to do? She asked. Originally? Marcus said. I came here to gather evidence. Proof of what really happened that could be shared with the galactic community. The truth has a way of undermining lies, even lies that entire civilizations are built on. Originally? What changed? Marcus looked directly at her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. You did, Princess. And your parents' conversation this evening. Zarathil's blood went cold. You were listening? I've been monitoring palace communications since I arrived, Marcus admitted. Not out of malice, but because understanding the current political climate is essential for what I came here to do. But tonight's conversation changed everything. How? Your mother asked questions that no one in power has asked for 3,000 years, Marcus said. She wondered whether the elimination of humanity might have been wrong. More than that, she suggested that your civilization has a responsibility to confront its past honestly. She did, Zarathil agreed quietly. It shocked me. It shocked me too, Marcus said. For centuries, my people have assumed that justice could only come through exposure and confrontation. We believed that the truth would have to be forced on a galaxy that didn't want to hear it. But tonight, I heard a member of the royal family voluntarily questioning the foundations of consortium authority. What does that mean? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with some internal decision. It means, Princess, that maybe there's another path forward. Maybe justice doesn't have to come through conflict. Before Zarathil could ask what he meant by that, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the archives. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with military precision. Marcus immediately tensed, his entire demeanor shifting from contemplative to alert. Security patrol, he whispered. Much more extensive than usual. The lockdown, Zarathil replied. They're searching everywhere. You need to leave, Marcus said urgently. If they find you here with me, they'll find us both anyway, Zarathil interrupted. There's nowhere for you to hide in this section. Marcus looked around the archives, assessing escape routes with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime evading detection. But the approaching footsteps were coming from multiple directions, suggesting a coordinated sweep that would be impossible to avoid. There is one option, Marcus said slowly. What? You could reveal my presence yourself, he said. Claim you discovered me during one of your explorations. It would protect you from accusations of collaboration. Zarathil stared at him in shock. You're asking me to betray you? I'm asking you to make a choice, Marcus replied. Between protecting someone you've known for a few days and protecting your own future. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the systematic sound of shelves being searched. In minutes, possibly less, the security forces would reach their location. There's a third option, Zarathil said suddenly. What? You surrender voluntarily. But not to the security forces, to my parents. Directly. Marcus's expression showed surprise. Princess, that would be incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. Maybe, Zarathil agreed. But, you said yourself that my mother is asking the right questions. What if she's ready for the right answers? And, if she isn't? Zarathil took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape her entire future. Then, at least we'll know we tried to find justice instead of revenge. The footsteps were very close now, close enough that they could hear voices conducting the search. In moments, they would be discovered whether they chose it or not. Marcus looked at her with an expression of amazement. "You're willing to risk everything on the possibility that your parents might be ready to hear the truth?" "I'm willing to risk everything on the possibility that truth is stronger than lies," Zarathil replied. "Isn't that what you've been fighting for?" For the first time since she had met him, Marcus smiled with something approaching hope. "Yes, Princess. That's exactly what we've been fighting for." "Then, come with me," Zarathil said, standing up and moving toward the archive entrance. "It's time to introduce you to my parents." As they walked toward what might be either salvation or disaster, Marcus spoke quietly. "Princess, whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you has changed how I see this galaxy. For 3,000 years, my people have carried hatred in our hearts for the civilization that destroyed us. But, hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it as much as the one it's directed toward. What will you carry instead?" Zarathil asked. "Hope," Marcus replied. "For the first time in 3 millennia, I have hope that humans and the galaxy might find a way to coexist." They emerged from the archives to find themselves facing a squad of armed security officers, led by Captain Morthek himself. The captain's expression shifted from professional alertness to complete shock as he recognized the princess and took in the presence of her companion. "Princess Zarathil," he said carefully, "please step away from that individual and move toward our position." "Captain Morthek," Zarathil replied with all the royal authority she could muster, "I need you to escort myself and my guest to see my parents immediately." "Princess, I'm afraid that's not possible." "This individual is potentially dangerous." "This individual," Zarathil interrupted, "has information that my parents need to hear." "And, Captain?" "His name is Marcus Chen. He's a human." The words hit the security squad like a physical blow. Several officers actually stepped backward, their weapons training on Marcus with the automatic response of people suddenly faced with their civilization's greatest nightmare. But Marcus made no aggressive moves. Instead, he slowly raised his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire corridor. "I am Marcus Chen," he said clearly. "I am a human, and I have come to speak with the rulers of the Galactic Consortium. I come not as an enemy, but as someone seeking justice for crimes committed long ago. I place myself under the protection of Princess Zarathil and request an audience with their majesties." The silence that followed was so complete that the palace harmonics seemed to pause. Then, Captain Morthek activated his communication device with hands that shook only slightly. "Your Majesty," he said into the device, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Princess Zarathil is safe, but she has encountered an individual who claims to be human." The pause that followed was filled with the weight of 3,000 years of history. Then, Emperor Kethvar's voice came through the communicator, steady but strained. "Escort them to the throne room, Captain." "All of them." "And, Captain? Make sure they arrive safely." As the security escort formed around them, Zarathil looked at Marcus and saw that his expression had changed once again. The weariness was still there, but it was now mixed with something that might have been the beginning of peace. "Thank you, Princess," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, thank you for giving truth a chance." They began the long walk to the throne room, where the fate of more than just 2 individuals would be decided. The galaxy was about to confront its past, and Princess Zarathil had chosen to stand at the center of that confrontation. For better or worse, the Age of Secrets was about to end. The throne room of the Galactic Consortium had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the negotiation of treaties that shaped the destiny of entire species, and the rendering of judgments that echoed across the stars. Built on a scale that dwarfed even the grandest cathedrals of ancient Earth, the chamber rose in sweeping arcs that seemed to disappear into infinity, its walls alive with the harmonic resonances that had become the signature of Kethmori architecture. But tonight, as Princess Zarathil walked beside Marcus Chen through the vast space, flanked by an escort of nervous security officers, the throne room felt different. The harmonics seemed discordant, as if the very walls were struggling to process the historical impossibility of a human standing in the heart of consortium power. Emperor Kethvar and Empress Salandra sat upon the twin thrones that had been carved from a single massive crystal, their luminescent skin casting subtle patterns of light across the polished surfaces. Both rulers maintained the composed expressions that 3 millennia of diplomatic tradition demanded, but Zarathil could see the tension in her father's posture and the way her mother's hands gripped the armrests of her throne. Behind the royal couple stood an array of advisors, military commanders, and government officials who had been hastily summoned when news of the encounter reached the upper levels of the palace. Their faces displayed varying degrees of shock, fear, and fascination as they looked upon a being that should not exist. The procession stopped at the traditional distance from the thrones, and Captain Morthek stepped forward to make the formal announcement that protocol demanded, even in circumstances that no protocol could have anticipated. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "I present Princess Zarathil, safe and unharmed, and her companion, who identifies himself as Marcus Chen and claims to be of human origin." Emperor Kethvar studied Marcus with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile impossible information with undeniable reality. "You claim to be human," he said finally, his voice carrying the formal tones reserved for matters of state. "I am human, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his own voice steady and respectful. "I am the descendant of those who escaped the extermination of my species 3,000 years ago." A murmur ran through the assembled officials, the kind of collective intake of breath that occurred when fundamental assumptions about reality were suddenly challenged. Empress Salandra leaned forward slightly, her expression showing the intellectual curiosity that had made her legendary throughout the galaxy. "If what you claim is true," she said, "then you represent an impossibility. Our records clearly show that all human settlements were identified and neutralized." "Your records show what those in power wanted them to show," Marcus replied carefully. "The truth is more complex." "Explain," Emperor Kethvar commanded. Marcus took a breath, and, when he spoke, his words carried the weight of millennia of hidden pain. "When the consortium decided that humanity could not be allowed to exist, some of my people saw what was coming. They prepared hidden refuges in regions of space that your forces believed to be uninhabitable. Using technologies that the consortium never fully understood, they entered long-term suspended animation, waiting for a time when it might be safe to emerge." "How many?" Empress Salandra asked quietly. "Few," Marcus admitted. "A few thousand at most, scattered across multiple sites. The consortium was very thorough in its genocide. But some survived, and, over the centuries, those survivors have been working toward a single goal.